Good afternoon. My name is Andrew Hubbard. I'm Editor-in-Chief of Taxation magazine. I'm speaking to you coming directly from hearing the budget speech, and I thought over the next few minutes I'd give you some immediate reaction to what we've just heard. Obviously, at this moment we are still awaiting lots of the detail, and my colleagues are working through all of the detailed press releases. But I think a useful overview will be helpful. I will say at the end how you can access more detailed information about the budget. Well, I've been listening to budget speeches for at least 30 years, and this was in many ways the most extraordinary. The context of a new Chancellor, a new government, Brexit, all of those things that we thought were going to be important suddenly become almost marginal compared to the coronavirus outbreak and the impact that it will have on the public finances. Huge amounts of money being spent on activity relating to coronavirus. If you look in the government's Red Book, which illustrates the expenditure and savings that will come as a result of the budget statement, everything else is dwarfed by the coronavirus issues. But nonetheless, there was an element, at least, of normality around the latter part of the budget. Indeed, it was a budget of two halves. In the first half, the new Chancellor was very solemn, very statesmanlike in the way that he addressed the serious issues and looked for all party support. And then suddenly, it all changed. He got terribly enthusiastic about what he was delivering, and I thought he was going to hyperventilate at one point, but he did eventually calm down. But I've never seen a budget of such contrast before. So what actually has changed? Well, this is not a budget of fundamental tax reform. We thought it might be, but circumstances have dictated otherwise. But we did get more than a hint that we're going to get another budget later in the year. You will recall that the previous Chancellor decided that there was no need for two fiscal events. Well, that has already changed because we are going to get, let's call it, another budget in the autumn. And I suspect that we will get far more detail of tax policy there, sketching out in much more detail some of the things that are really just hinted about here in the budget. But there are some things that we need to talk about. I think the first one is entrepreneurs' relief. Now, before the budget, there was a huge amount of publicity about entrepreneurs' relief. Did it actually have the right effect? Did it encourage entrepreneurs, or was it just a tax handout to the rich? We at Taxation magazine did a series of articles around this, and there was a very big divergence of opinion among tax practitioners about whether or not entrepreneurs' relief was actually effective. So we were waiting to see whether or not it was going to be abolished. And the Chancellor to some extent teased with us, suggesting that the relief was not fit for purpose, expensive, etc., and didn't actually encourage entrepreneurs. But then he rode back and hasn't abolished entrepreneurs' relief. He's reduced the limit from £10 million to £1 million, effective from today, so there's no planning you can do to get round the change in relief limits. But otherwise, as far as I can see, he's left it pretty well untouched. Now, for many, many people, that £1 million limit will be perfectly sufficient. So I think entrepreneurs will be breathing a sigh of relief. What else was there for businesses? Well, business rates is clearly a massive issue for so many businesses, particularly small high street businesses struggling against online competition. And there was a very significant change in the business rate rules for smaller businesses in the leisure hospitality industry, as well as a promise of a further consultation on business rate reform. We've had consultations before. They never seem quite to get anywhere. This is such an intractable problem, but perhaps this time we will see some fundamental changes. In terms of the taxes that we as practitioners deal with, relatively modest changes. So we did see, for instance, small increases in the research and development tax credits and in the allowances for buildings and structures, but nothing fundamental. We already knew that the tax cut, which was proposed by his predecessor, sorry, that should be predecessor but one, the Chancellor's changed so frequently these days, has been reined back, and so corporation tax will remain at 19%. But otherwise, I think businesses can probably say that as far as direct tax is concerned, there is not going to be that much effect. Although, of course, the small print is illuminating. I have been working through this as much as I can in the few minutes since the speech, and there is one thing that I notice, which is a proposal that large businesses will, from April 2021, required to notify HMRC, and I quote here, when they take a tax position which HMRC is likely to challenge. Now that's going to be a very interesting thing, because how do you know whether HMRC are likely to challenge a tax position? I think the detail of that, as it will be negotiated over the next year, will be fascinating and potentially could have very far-reaching effects for large businesses. But what about individuals? Well, a few months ago, all the talk was of massive reductions in personal tax, increases in allowances, quite a revolution. That's all been scaled back. And all we now have is the relatively modest increase in the national insurance thresholds taking place from 6th of April, which we already knew about. The Chancellor tried to spin this as something new, as Chancellors very often do, but there was nothing there that we didn't already know about. But unless, again, there's something buried in the small print, there are no changes to headline rates or allowances. We look in budgets for things where there might have been changes and there weren't. And one of those is pensions tax relief. Almost every budget that I remember has predicted somewhere along the line that there will be a reduction in the amount of tax relief that people can have on pension contributions. No sign of that. Indeed, it went the other way, because for very high earners, particularly doctors, but it doesn't appear to be restricted to doctors, there has been an increase in the threshold, which means that no longer will doctors have to refuse overtime, because if they were paid overtime, they'd end up worse off because of pension clawback. But other than that, it doesn't appear that pensions tax relief has been touched. Perhaps the biggest change to business, which will also be affected by consumers, is the announcement on VAT on digital delivery of books, etc. We've had this strange position that if you buy a physical book, you don't pay VAT, whereas if you buy an electronic book, you do pay VAT. Now, the VAT rules were written at a time when there were no such things as digital books, and the tax tribunals looked quite recently at this whole position and decided that, perhaps surprisingly, the existing rules could be interpreted in a way which said that a newspaper delivered digitally could be zero rated for VAT, i.e. no VAT charged on it. Now, that obviously caused very significant interest in the whole publishing industry, and the expectation was that HMRC would perhaps appeal against that decision. But instead, they've taken what I still think is a surprising course, which is said that they will be removing the VAT on electronic books and other publications. Now, that will not take place until, I think, the 1st of December this year, which is clearly very good news for consumers coming up to Christmas. It does mean, I suspect, that nobody is going to buy electronic publications in November, because they will be 20% higher than they will be in December. So there might be a lull there, but overall it will reduce the cost of electronic delivery of publications. a tax on learning, it was described as. I suppose you could say that this is a post-Brexit dividend because clearly we've got much more control now about where VAT is and isn't charged. But I mentioned the B word and it hardly got any mention in the budget at all. And that really comes back to my opening thought. This budget was completely derailed by coronavirus. All of the things that we had been expecting about the post-Brexit world, what tax changes, what the tax regime was going to look like, have gone by the wayside. This is very clearly a major national issue relating to the whole of economy. There was some talk at some time about what would be the effect if 20% of the population were off sick at any one time. That's really quite a sobering thought on budget day. So I'll leave you with the thought that we will remember this budget for a long time to come, not as a great tax reforming budget, but as a budget against a very sober and somber backdrop. It almost felt like a budget that was being raised at a time of great national conflict and war. I hope the coronavirus is not quite like that, but clearly it has dominated thinking. And I suspect that the budget only was put to bed this morning. We obviously had the changes to the Bank of England interest rates this morning, and the Chancellor was candid enough to accept that some of the economic forecasts had not been updated to take account of the latest developments of coronavirus. No doubt things will move over the next few days. So I hope you found that interesting as just a general overview. As I say, I'm doing this before all of the press releases have been issued and I haven't read every part of the small print. So there might be some surprises tucked away. In order to find out, it's very easy. You just follow our insight and further coverage on our dedicated budget hub, which is tolley.co.uk/budget20. There you will get our overnight summary of the budget, and then over the next days, more detailed commentary from our experts as we start to really understand what this budget actually means. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you keep healthy and well, and goodbye from me.